Just to let you know, this review is going to include spoilers for the game's features, story, and characters. So if you haven't played the game, go play it for yourself, then come back to this video. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is the single-player game that follows the journey of Cal Kestis, a Jedi Padawan who managed to escape Order 66. And the game's set in sort of the infant stage of the Empire rising up, and with the hunting of Jedi still being one of its main priorities. So it's set in this really interesting era of passing over from the prequels to the originals, which I really like. It really helps mould the two eras together. And essentially the plot revolves around you playing as Cal Kestis. You get wind of this holocron that has the names of Force-sensitive children. So your goal throughout the game is to essentially recover this before the Empire does. And initially Cal wants to rebuild the Empire with it, but he somewhat changes his views along the lines. And I do want to get onto Cal now because he's the character you play as and is the central protagonist. And I think if you're looking at the game quite bare bones, Cal looks pretty generic. He's a typical sort of hero's journey, but I actually quite like him, and I think the more you think about him, the more unique he feels. I think it's great that we're getting the viewpoint of a Jedi being on the run. It's something we haven't really seen before. I guess we've seen Obi-Wan being in hiding in the originals, but we've never seen sort of cat and mouse chase between the Empire and the Jedi. And I think this game does a really good job of portraying the viewpoint of being sort of a Jedi facing against this overwhelming force, delving into somewhat of like fear and trauma. And I think that's a great story and character that definitely molds straight into sort of the story of Star Wars. Like I mentioned then, trauma, Cal is very much held back by our past events. They constantly play on his mind, and a lot of this game is him sort of overcoming, somewhat regret, I guess, but also self-blame. Because you get to see Order 66, which is a great sequence that plays out. And he sees his master die, and he somewhat blames himself. You see that throughout the game, and when Cal starts to believe in himself more, I think that's great. And I love a lot of this game is Cal's character growth. He's definitely in his confidence. You just have to look at the beginning of the game and at the end. Look at his first fight with the second sister and his last fight with the second sister. He's absolutely terrified at the beginning. And that's because he has got all these sort of internal demons almost, and he's dealing with a lot. And he's somewhat suppressing so much inside him, and that makes him very somewhat timid in his real life as well. But by the end of it, he's learned to grow above all that. And he's learned to move on from the past, but still learn the lessons from it. And I think that's such a great story for a character, A lot of people are stuck in the past and often blame that for their hardships now. And I like how this game essentially teaches the lesson of the past is important and should be acknowledged. Literally, in the game, you learn skills from Cal remembering his training. It's even past a metaphorical sense in that way. But also to move past them and not let, that stuff hold you back to change in the future. And I think that's overall a great message and a great sort of growth for a character, and one you can really get invested in and somewhat relate to. Everyone's, I think, goes through moments like that in life, and I think that's a great way to portray it, especially in a game where you are that character. And like I was mentioning with the confidence, I think it's great that as Cal's confidence grows as a character, you grow more confident as a player. You'll get better at the combat, and you unlock more skills, and you put them to more use, and you come up with more creative ways to deal with problems, and that somewhat matches Cal in a sense. And I think that's a great way of merging the player's interaction with the preset story conditions, and I think that's a great way to get the player involved. And now onto some other characters. You're saved by the crew of the Mentis in the beginning, where you're being hunted and they manage to pick you up and get you out of there. And the captain of the ship is Grease, and he's alright. He's sort of like this weird working class alien dude, gypsy guy, I don't know. But you quite get to grow and quite like him. And it's great how you can just spend time with them and you somewhat get to understand the characters and feel them outside just the story beats. You can interact with characters on the ship, which I always think is a great feature when you can interact with characters outside of the actual story. And the other character on the ship is Sierra Junda, and she's a previous Jedi, and you learn more about her throughout the game, how she was a master who lost her Padawan, but in a different way than you'd expect. The Padawan didn't die. She was transformed into a monster essentially, somewhat similar to like Anakin and Obi-Wan. So it's great seeing her point of view, especially when she's talking with Cal. You can see she wants Cal to be better than what she ever was. And I think that's a great way to do a mentor with how Cal's previous master feeling useless, Jaro to Paul. She doesn't feel like he's Jedi master in a sense, more so he's mentoring a sense of character, if you get what I mean. Later on, you also get Merrin as part of the crew, who starts off as somewhat of an antagonist. And again, she's somewhat similar to Cal, where trauma is a big part of her character. And you can see by that trauma, she's been easily manipulated and become very rageful. And I think it's great, somewhat like Cal's character somewhat opens her eyes to the truth. And speaking of who she was manipulated by, Taron Malicos, I think is a really interesting character. And I think it's a shame he's only in this game a small amount. But he's this fallen Jedi who's, just lost his way, and he's become like this person hell-bent on power and ruling, because that's what he needed to be to survive, and that somewhat consumed him, and I think that's such a good character. And he has a similar outlook to Count Dooku as well, which I quite like, because to me, Count Dooku, we didn't get a lot of his character, so hopefully Taron Malicos isn't dead, whatever happened to him. He gets like eaten by the ground in this. Hopefully he returns in the sequel, because I think his philosophy on the Jedi could be very interesting going forward, and it could really create that inner conflict in Cal. And speaking of other antagonists, we've got the Nam sister, who's like just kind of a brute.
I found the Jedi! Liar!
She don't have much character, and you chop her hand off and push her off a tree. And I'm pretty sure she's not dead. She's going to come back in another one. But to be honest, if we never saw her again, I wouldn't be that bothered. The main sort of antagonist you face is Trilla Seduri, who is the second sister, and she's Sierra Junda's old Padawan. And you can see how she's been manipulated by fear and pain, and she's become everything, she probably didn't want to be, and especially what Sierra didn't want her to be. And she's a really good character because she's someone who can't let go of her pain and her past. And, that's great in terms of symbolism between her and Cal. They are very much mirroring characters. I do think it's a shame, though, at the end. I'm going to get more onto the end when I speak about the actual boss battles. But for her to be killed off, because I think there could have been still some character there, which, could have been interesting in a sequel or whatever. But I understand why they did it, because it shows the consequences of not moving on. So yeah, I'm kind of on the fence about that decision. I can see the positives and the negatives. Now more onto the sort of the gameplay aspect of the game. I really enjoy the combat in this game because it isn't just like stupid idiot button mashing. There's actual somewhat skill to it. You're not an OP character like some of the previous Star Wars games where you can just run through enemies. This feels very real in a Star Wars sense, obviously. Whereas, you look at some of the previous stuff and you're like, how could a Jedi be killed by stormtroopers? But when you're playing as Cal, you more understand it, being overwhelmed and having to cover multiple angles at once. It can be frustrating at times, and I quite like that, It is real to the Star Wars universe, and I think that's great. Stuff is dangerous, and it also shows that Jedi are mortal. They're not godlike beings. They are to the average person, like they would be to me and you, but they can still die, At the end of the day, they're still human or, alien, whatever. But, there's a big emphasis on parrying and dodging in this game. It's a lot about being patient, and I quite like that. You can't just button mash, and the lightsaber is very fluid, and the animations are great. They don't get old, even though it is like the same sort of style of swinging and whatever. I wish they added sort of different lightsaber form fighting. That would be quite good. And as you're going along, you also unlock more force powers and traversal options, which really help elevate the combat and help it evolve throughout the game so it doesn't get stale. And I like how it somewhat drip feeds you this stuff. You don't just get it easily at the start, and you can't just go out your way and just get it. You need to progress the actual story to get it. So it feels like the combat's evolving. And also with the force abilities and traversal options, that somewhat leads into my next part, which is the puzzles in this game. I always enjoy games where they somewhat test you. I wish there were some more difficult ones, like some of them are a bit too simple if you ask me. And I know it's, quite a wide audience range, but, maybe some sort of spin-off ones and stuff like that, add a bit more challenge in the puzzle area, because the combat area has challenge with the different difficulties. So why is there not as much challenge when it comes to the mental problems. Do you get what I mean? And during gameplay, you're also assisted by BD1, who's like your companion droid, and he's another really great character. I think it's great, you sort of the relationship between him and Cal, because they spend the entire game together, and I love how they sort of work together as a team, and you can upgrade BD1, so he unlocks new stuff, and you work together more and more with those new upgrades, like him hacking droids and stuff like that. But also the idea that he heals you adds a level of companionship, which I think is really great. And he also offers hints as well, if you are struggling on puzzles and stuff, which I think is a great idea because it makes sense in the story. Like, if you had a droid there who, could figure it out, you'd listen to him, you get what I mean? And speaking on sort of the save points of the game and stuff, a lot of people have compared it to Dark Souls with the campfires, and it definitely is inspired by that, where you've got these meditation points which allow you to spend your skill points and also save the game. And I love the aspect of risk reward where it resets the enemy if you save it there. It adds challenge to the game, which I like. Games are much more interesting when they are challenging rather than just a breeze and you just walk through them. And I do like somewhat the in-universe explanation, which I like to think of him with. When you die on a playthrough, that's Cal somewhat meditating and he's planning that version of events out in his head, and that doesn't work, so he goes back to square one and starts again. I like that little detail if you think about it, if you're super bothered about how it should work and stuff. Now, the game has a host of different planets you get to visit throughout the game. You've got Nur and Bracca, which aren't really explorable ones, they just serve as the location for, a mission, I'm pretty sure, for each. But the actual exploration ones are quite interesting, and I love how they're quite varied, and we're getting a mix of original planets and also planets we've seen before in other mediums. It's quite a nice variety, and it's not, ones we normally see too often. So we've got Ilum, which is like the planet where Jedi go to train and they get the Kyber crystal. I'd say that one's the least interesting because I think it is the smallest, but it's great aesthetically and in terms of vibes, and I love the inspiration of there being a lot of puzzles there because it matches sort of how Jedi train there, The combat isn't really too prevalent there, and I quite like that sort of tying with that. I think that's a really good idea. You've also got Bogano, which is somewhat your starting planet, and it's like this future swamp. It's all sort of flat, and it's got canyons and crevices. And it very much does feel like a tutorial area. I do like it aesthetically, but it is very basic to some of the ones I do prefer. And onto the ones which I think have definitely got the most time put onto them, which is Kashyyyk, which is the Wookiee home planet that we got to see in Revenge of the Sith. That's great. And we're seeing stuff we haven't seen there before, but we're also seeing it in this period we haven't seen it in before, which is the crossover from the prequels to the originals. So you get to see sort of the Imperial integration into the natural world of Kashyyyk, and it creates this really great clash. We also have Dathomir, which is Darth Maul's home planet, which is great, and it very much harkens to sort of old dark territories out of like fantasy films. If you're looking at something like Mordor, you can see somewhat inspiration there, and it's definitely this dark, desolate, horrific and horrible place, and it feels like it'd be a nightmare to try and survive there. And it is very much this horror setting, and I love when you get there, it feels very quiet, it creates this very ominous, spooky tone, and I really do like that. But also the lack of anything new there shows how isolated it is. You don't fight Imperials there, and I really like that. It makes it feel super secluded, and if someone crashed there, they'd be done for. You'd be sort of at the mercy of this world. But my favourite planet in the game is an original one, and that's Zepho. I think they definitely put the most time into this planet because it's definitely the most varied and detailed. You've got the crashed capital ship that you can explore, and it's all flooded and stuff like that. You've also got the Imperial Manning area, which shows them somewhat destroying culture and really matches, and shows us why the Empire is bad. But you've also got, the ancient tombs and the villages there of the people that live there. And just aesthetically, it's great. And the three sort of different aspects of that world help it really feel different, even though you're all in the same place. And like I said, with Zepho having these ancient tombs, you get to learn a lot of like the ancient history of the Star Wars world. And that's quite a big theme throughout the game. Zepho has a temple, and so does Dathomir as well, and Bogano does as well. But the Dathomir and Zepho ones you explore more, and you can see this old culture, and it somewhat feels alien in a Star Wars universe, if you get what I mean. and it has just the right amount of sort of history but also mystery. So you know enough, but also, you know, not enough to the point where it does feel like ancient history. You know, there are gaps missing, and I do quite like that. And just the visuals of this place and the architecture is great. But you've also got Cal's ability to touch objects and recall an event that surrounds them. And that, again, creates, you know, different pockets of knowledge you can get throughout the game, and you can somewhat piece different events together. Like, one I remember is on Zephyr, you can scan something and it will be like an officer speaking, and you can scan something later and it's the same officer being killed, and then you'll see like there's a body there and stuff. And even though it's just voice acting, you can really visualize events, and it's such a good thing to learn about different areas, you know, that a lot of people might pass up, but I think it's great story-wise. Just little subtle mini stories there, and I think that's really great stuff, because it's something they could have easily not done. I'd say the only downside to these locations is the fact they feel too restrictive and not open world enough to me. They're more like dungeons than actual open world planets, and I wish they were more like that. Obviously, this is a personal preference, but to me, I think it would have been better if you had an actual open world, then had areas that were more dungeon-like. Because I do like the dungeon aspect where you're exploring it and, you know, you have to do like a certain route and stuff. But I think that being on top of an open world where you can see something and actually go to it would have been much better. Because sometimes they feel a bit too restrictive and linear-esque. I know there is a lot of exploration, but there's only certain places you can go, and it once you've sort of seen it, there's not much more to see, if you get what I mean. So I do wish maybe in future, you know, in a sequel, have the locations be more open world-esque. You know, don't feel like it needs to be sort of route, if you get what I mean. That is the end of part 1 of the review. Be sure to catch part 2, which will be uploaded soon. So yeah, see you there.